Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it might be for you. Professor Barry here today, or this lecture. The focus is on stratification, a real interesting topic, a foundational topic in sociology, because stratification happens in different ways: class, race, gender, other areas in which we are stratified. And it's developing analytical tools to think about how and why we are stratified, think about the mechanisms behind stratification, just basically peeling some layers back on the topic of stratification to be able to better understand, and then also be more empowered to be able to address stratification and as a collective, right, at a societal level. All right, so here let's kind of walk through some different things. I mean, one image, I don't know, stratification is just layering. Okay, it's just a layering, a ranking. You could sort of talk about it as a ranking. And so you can see it, there's a ranking there. All societies, there's stratification, but it doesn't mean that it's how it's stratified is natural, inevitable, or a byproduct of just individual decision making. So the viewpoint and perspective is that stratification is humanly created. We create that. Different groups are in different positions to help shape stratification. So it's not inevitable. It's not. It may exist in all systems, and we'll talk about this. But how it gets expressed in a particular society is related to societal and cultural values, technology, kind of history in terms of intergroup relations between different groups. Just a host of factors that we will get into some of that. I put in here, as I mentioned before, I put all these different terms in here before, or with each of these different PowerPoints, just something for you if you want to be able to define these terms, these ideas. That the worksheet is really what you kind of focus on for, preparation for the midterm and for later on the final exam. But this may be helpful as well. Anyway, I just want to put that out there for you. It's not required, just something maybe you want to track along with. Okay, so stratification, we can think about stratification in so many different ways, right? Think about, or in different examples and illustrations. The one I use here, I think the airport and the airline industry in general is such a great example of stratification. You go walk into the airport, right? And you have the fast track for TSA. Well, there's stratification already. We're already differentiating between those who, and maybe they're, people who are business travelers, right? So they have a different status, or people who paid for pre-clearance through TSA. So there's stratification within that. We could look at who is at the counter in terms of the flight, and those who are checking people in. Look at the gender balance of individuals who are checking people in. It's predominantly, a higher ratio of women to males to females to males in those particular positions. We think about, who are the pilots, right? And think about flight attendants. It's pretty amazing, right? 94% of pilots are male for commercial airlines. So stratification going on. So it's asking the question, how did it become that way? How do we think about that stratification? Think about the club, you get into the airport and there's this special access to the special area in the airport for those who are frequent flyers or belong to the particular American Airlines flight club. Think about our baggage, right, is communicating ideas of status and position. So there's that aspect of it as well. And it's, interesting, this language, like first class, economy, or coach, you just got this, we have this language difference. We have the architecture design of the airplane being different for first class, and, what is served. You can go on and on and on, right? Look at sports as another example. Look at football is a good example in a lot of ways in terms of racial stratification within football. We look at the racial composition or demographics of those who are on the offensive line, defensive line, specific positions within football. Quarterback, for example, right? In different running back. Sort of think about how how stratification works on the football field, as well as coaching staff, the owners of football franchises. I mean, there's just different ways of sort of unpackaging it. So there's just a couple different examples. Thinking about stratification, we're talking about distribution of people in certain positions, right? So looking at gender, race, class, other factors related to stratification. So we already defined it. So now we can kind of talk a little bit about, well, here's another little bit more detailed definition in thinking about stratification. But that's the definition. So now we can kind of go to different principles of stratification. One is that it's universal. I mean, all societies have some degree of stratification. So you kind of go back in terms of there's different types of societies. Like right now we're in a post-industrial society, started from the 1970s and on. From the, let's say, 1800s all the way through the 1970s, we were in a industrial capitalist society. So the rise of industrialism in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s. So that's another type of society. Before that, it's predominantly agricultural or agrarian societies, which emerged 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. Before that was hunting and gathering types of societies, pastoral, horticultural-based societies. And I guess those are two different types of societies, horticultural, pastoral, and then hunting and gathering before that. But stratification really takes off in agricultural-based societies 7,000, 10,000 years ago. It's the first time that humans are congregating, developing cities. Cities are growing and expanding, and it's that time period that that there's an expansion of stratification. Hunting and gathering societies and pastoral, horticultural-based societies are fairly egalitarian for a variety of different reasons. In modern day societies, I mean, this idea that's universal, stratification exists in every modern day society. And the question is, while it's universal, there's a lot of variability to it across nations. Even within different states within the United States, different degrees of stratification exist between, if we're looking at class, we're looking at different distribution of different demographics. Also, stratification is very persistent. It's hard to change. It's resistant to change. And that could be because of things like technology, get established. And it's hard for example, just sort of the advancement of computer technology. And that computer technology has transformed our economy in very powerful ways. And it's hard to change some of the impacts and influences of that technology on kind of the social world itself. So it's resistant to change. It's also resistant to change because people have a vested interest in maintaining a particular system, right? So there could be issues of power that are operating that people are trying to protect the existing order. And then also the third one, really important, we'll talk about, is that stratification is supported by ideologies or belief systems. I mentioned before, maybe this book I just finished reading last night, The Nordic Theory of Everything, written by someone from Norway who ends up coming to the United States, living in the United States, reflecting on the United States and America and organization of our societies. And, she, at the end of the book, she kind of basically talking about this sort of the American dream concept. It comes up throughout her book, but this sort of ideology, this belief that we have in America about if you work hard enough and you are devoted enough, you can become monetarily, materially successful. It's like the American dream sort of idea, right? So we maintain our inequality. We're at the height of inequality. We are the separation between the top and the bottom is higher than it's been since the 1920s. So we have a great degree of disparity between the top and the bottom, specifically the top 1% has really expanded in growth and development. And the bottom 20% has been economically stagnant for the last 40, 50 years for basically. So how do we maintain that inequality? Well, that inequality is maintained because we have to have a belief system to maintain it, right? There has to be a way to justify it. And we justify it by saying, well, everybody has equal opportunity. If people take advantage of the opportunity, they can move themselves as well. So that's like one of the ideologies that we have. There's a Marxist-based position on social rank too that are, so Marx, the conflict theory perspective, that stratification is related to your relationship to production. Are you an owner of production, or are you a worker? So are you a producer? And this is the classic division or categorization for Marx, is it's the owners, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat, the workers. So for Marx, it all depended upon your rank depends on your relationship to basically the system of production. You think about it by, today's world, it works, it's a little bit more complicated than in Marx's time. You have different positions within organizations. But there's that sort of thought, the closer you are attached to basically the heart of an industry, the more you're at the center of power, the more you're at the center of control. You have status, you have power, you have wealth that are kind of accumulated with that. The worker is at the mercy of, has significantly less power than the owner. And then Max Weber had kind of the idea that we think about stratification, we think about status, prestige, and wealth. And that's what's kind of here on this diagram here, is that it could be that, a person has a lot of wealth, but not a lot of status, or they have a lot of status, but not a lot of power. So there's these three different, positions, right? So we look at a plumber, a master plumber makes a lot of money, more money than a K through 12 teacher who's maybe been in the profession for, let's say, 5 years. But the teacher has more prestige for the position than the plumber itself. So Weber kind of gets us into that symbolic world a little bit about the meaning that we're attaching to different positions and different ideas. So different class systems, I already mentioned this a little bit, but thinking about, or I guess maybe I didn't, another way of thinking about class systems or thinking about stratification is doing sort of a little bit of a comparison to different kinds of systems. So the one is we have there's a caste system where this is India. Usually India is the case, the textbook example, where a caste, people are born into a caste and it's a closed social mobility. So there's no opportunity for leaving that social position. So if you're born into a particular place within the caste, that's where you stay. And then here's some of the common castes that existed in India. Well, India is transforming. They don't have the caste system like it existed before, but there's remnants of that still exist in India. Prior to our development in the Western world, European and then also America, thinking about class-based systems. Before we got to class-based systems, in Europe, feudal-based societies where you had kings and queens, nobles, knights, and then you had the peasants, right? So there's a stratification going on there in terms of organization. So this, I think, is a good example. You go from a feudal-based society to industrial capitalism. In industrial capitalism, you have the workers at the bottom, the proletariat. You have the bourgeoisie, then you have these different places within the system to maintain it. So there's the military to maintain things, the religious structure to basically keep people complacent or to keep the system into place. Then you have those in power who actually do all the ruling. But the organizational piece for Marx is capitalism that's driving everything. That's that materialist kind of concept and idea. Well, okay, so caste, this idea that closed social mobility, right? So closed social mobility, that you're born into a position, you stay in that position. This is a very intriguing book. Isabel Wilkerson, this came out last year before, read it not too long ago. Listened to some podcasts. There's great podcast. Ezra Klein does a great interview with Isabel Wilkerson talking about her work with caste. And basically her argument is that America is very much a caste system, both in terms of class and in race. So we think about, racial stratification, class stratification, and her argument is that America has been, from the beginning of its kind of foundation, a caste-based system. Even how the foundation of our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, sort of our rights, our constitutional rights, embedded in that has always been systems to maintain inequality or to maintain the privilege of certain groups within society itself, and that we are oriented around this sort of system of caste. So very intriguing. If you're interested, check out some podcasts. of some interviews with Isabel Wilkerson. Michelle Alex, I mean, in a more contemporary or a different topic, looking at the war on drugs and looking at our criminal justice policy regarding nonviolent drug offenses as well as other offenses, and looking at the war on drugs as a caste, as a way of, as an example of caste kind of stuff. That we're keeping, that systems are designed and keeping people into particular social places. Another example of caste too, this came out a few years ago, it's called The Color of Law, basically about how banking industries were, were loaning, prohibiting the loaning home loans for African Americans and other people of color within certain residential areas. And that impacted the ability of people to develop wealth. Over a period of time, people didn't have that freedom of movement to be able to go to different areas that were growing and developing. So they're kind of stuck in their particular residential area because the banks wouldn't provide loans to them. I mean, that's like a caste-like kind of thing. So it's not as overt as in India, but there's some caste-like features in the United States. There's actually, this is the Negro Motorist Green Book, the travel guide for African Americans traveling in the South during the time period of legal segregation, even after the ending of segregation at public institutions in '54 with Brown versus Board of Education. Even after that, it's just sort of the guidebook for helping African Americans find locations, accommodations, places that were safe, places that were secure. I mean, that's all kind of communicating ideas about that there was a structure in place that differentiated between different groups. It's caste-like kind of thing. The concept of apartheid is very caste. So apartheid, South Africa is what we think about as apartheid. And very much like Jim Crow South here in the United States, separate facilities for whites and for blacks. It's institutionalized, it's in structures, it's reinforced by the law, all these different kind of things. There's a powerful film called Amandla. It's about Nelson Mandela and sort of this march for freedom, the march to end apartheid. It's a really powerful film. I think you'll enjoy it. And then when you download this PowerPoint, you can watch this video a little bit about thinking about apartheid as well. I'll leave it up to you to watch this if you want. This is about redlining and about what I mentioned here in this sort of book, The Color of Law, about how the banking industry not loaning to African Americans, putting red lines around certain areas where they say we won't provide loans to people within that area because it's high risk. But it was established that these policies and practices within the banking industry were illegal, unconstitutional, and discriminatory. And you think about like the development of the housing industry, suburbia, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, that if a group of people, if African Americans were not able to secure loans for properties within a particular area, forbidden from buying property in a particular area that's growing and developing, there's real long-term consequences to that, right? We get into facilitating segregation. It impacts people's ability to develop wealth. The biggest area where people develop wealth is through their homes, through equity that's built up in their homes. So the power of that is really, really profound. And this short video kind of walks through a little bit about not only did redlining, impact the accumulation of wealth, but it has impacts in terms of health, education, basic social infrastructure within communities, and then sort of also within law enforcement. Within the communities itself. Okay, so continuing on about these principles of stratification, looking at its variable, right? So it's universal, right? It's universal. There's one measurement of inequality within a society. It's called the Gini Coefficient, G-I-N-I. And the closer to one, the more unequal a society is. So here's a bunch of different countries, right? And here's the United States. This is where we're at in terms of the Gini coefficient. So a little bit more unequal. So just demonstrating that it's variable, right? And again, we're going to argue that this isn't natural or inevitable or simply a factor of market forces. There are a lot of other things that are coming into play that are shaping that. Another way of looking at the universal and variable too is looking at the social mobility, the degree to which there's intragenerational mobility. So it's one individual and their movement up and down, kind of social positions throughout the course of their life. There's intergenerational, across generations. So it's one person, their offspring, and what happens with their offspring? Do they move up or down? What happens to the offsprings and going back and back, right? So that's across generations, is intergenerational. One measurement of looking at that's often looked at is social mobility, the degree to which people can move up and down a social ladder, and things impact that, right? So a lot of privilege can impact that, wealth and parents passing on wealth to their kids, access to resources, education, quality education. There's a lot of factors that are shaping mobility that are beyond just individual effort, but that are kind of structured in society itself. Nordic countries really are, have high levels of social mobility. And the argument that she makes is that because people within the Nordic system, she calls it by the Nordic theory of love, that this idea that the basic social infrastructure is designed to facilitate individual freedom and individual achievement. So that basic social infrastructure is taken care of for everyone. So the place you're born into is less relevant than here in the United States, where you're born into, where in the community, what part of the community you're born in, who your parents and where they live, and on and on and on. It has more of a profound influence in terms of social mobility. So it's another indication in terms of looking at the degree to which people are mobile within a society itself. We kind of look at mobility, looking at different groups' experiences with mobility. Here on the left, of looking at for the Black middle class, African Americans, looking at the middle quintile. So usually it's one way of breaking down kind of income brackets. Bottom 20%. Nope, I just spilled my water. I just made a mess, spilled my water. All right. Yeah, it's one thing to look at things across time, right? So I guess it's quintile. So one way of kind of breaking things down and looking at things based on 20%. It's the bottom 20%, the next 20%, the middle 20%, the next 20%, and the top 20%. So breaking it down in fifths is one way of looking at it. And looking at it over a course of time, looking at it in terms of particular groups within society, it's one way of looking at what's happening with stratification. Another way of looking at it is, looking at generationally, the degree to which people are mobile. And the reality is that social mobility has decreased in the United States over a course of time. Probably 1950s was a time period, it's post-World War II, economic expansion and development. All boats were being lifted during that particular time period. And we really saw a profound change starting in the 1970s with a move to this sort of post-industrial economy. So other things that are affecting, the degree of stratification, things like tax rates. It's interesting to look at the marginal tax rate in the United States, looking at it over a course of time. It's variable, right? So I don't think you could argue that this is just market forces that are driving this. It's social policies. It's who's designing the policies, I think, are important questions regarding that. So you can kind of see that. And then we kind of look at this, is kind of interesting too, of looking at so gross domestic product, so the total combination basically of resources and production. And you could look at tax revenue, what percent of the total GDP is coming from tax revenue. And the United States is relatively low. That explains, in the Nordic model, much higher, right? So basic social infrastructure, education, universal childcare in Nordic country, universal childcare, universal healthcare, a year plus, sometimes 3 to 5 years in terms of paternity, maternity leave, mean, these kind of things that are meant to be equalizers are designed in the structure of those systems themselves, and it takes a tax base to do that. So it's how we think about taxes is so fascinating. There's a lot of aspects in how we think about kind of taxes. It's a story of how we think about government. It's how we think about the individual. It's all kinds of different things that are wrapped up in that. But I think it's important to understand of looking at, okay, what's happened to taxes over a course of time, so we can kind of see this kind of drop in terms of the tax rate for the most wealthy has gone down over a course of time in significant ways. The chart here on the right, looking at total share of total income going to the top 1% since 1900, and kind of look at this and kind of be able to just kind of establish that basically, so basically kind of demonstrating, right, if you can kind of look here, that the top 1%, their share of total income in the United States, as well as other English-speaking countries, was going down. So things were kind of closing, the gap closing, and then starting in 1970s, 1980s, it's really kind of climbed. And we are, the top 1% for us is just like, it's light years away. And that's kind of grown. That's a area of significant growth. And even the top 0.1% is really a concentration of significant wealth. So it's very variable. It's kind of interesting to think about things like Amazon. They pay certain taxes, payroll taxes that are part of that. But as far as federal income tax, paid 0 in 2019. It's variable. Why is it variable? What's going on? That's the investigation. That's the idea, right? So that was kind of theme 1. Theme 2 is getting into ideologies. How do we explain it? So ideologies are justifications and beliefs for why things are the way that they are. And we use this term in sociology. Many people, especially in the media, refer to extremist views or actions as being inspired by a particular ideology. Within sociology, what is known as the dominant ideology, or the particular ideology that is most common or most strong within a society. So it's the lens through which we view the world. It's the sum of all of our values, our beliefs, our expectations. I think it becomes taken for granted, like we don't realize what the ideology is sometimes. It's just part of our culture. We get fundamentally socialized into it. And so it's kind of like we're trying to investigate it. And we investigate it because it plays a significant role in shaping society itself. So Gramsci gets in this idea of ideology. He was a Marxist during the rise of fascist governments, totalitarian governments, in Europe, specifically within Italy and Mussolini. He was incarcerated for his opposition to the government. And while he was in prison, he wrote his famous prison notebooks, and he talks about this idea of cultural hegemony, that to maintain a system of inequality, it's controlling what people think and how people think. Because how you reproduce the system is we all have to participate in the reproduction of it in some way. So for example, if we all believe that if you just work hard enough, you can make it and you can be successful, and therefore if you're not successful, it's through your own fault. Well, if we become the carriers of that, right? We accept that ideology across social classes and positions and demographics. So we accept it, that acceptance is hegemony. It's domination by consent is one way of defining it. So it's this way of sort of the way in which domination happens. It's interesting too to kind of get into this idea of, as the book talks about, this idea of the just world hypothesis, that the world is a place that's just, right? And there's been a lot of research in psychology to kind of support this idea. Is that the world is just, right? That the world is set up to be fair. We want to believe that. We have ideologies in our place that are reinforcing us to believe that. The limitation and the challenge of that, the limitation is the world is not actually structured that way. And the consequences, we believe in this just world hypothesis, actually we work to protect it, right? We resist engaging with things that would challenge that idea that the world is a just world. And when we do that, then we start to get into victim blaming, that if people who aren't making it, we blame them versus looking at kind of the larger system and larger structure itself. So I don't know, a couple different quotes here. The first one here on the left, Zick Rubin of Harvard University, and Letitia Ann Poplou conducted surveys, examined the characteristics of people with strong beliefs in this just world idea, and found that people will have a strong tendency to believe in a just world, also are more religious, more fundamental, more authoritarian, more conservative, more likely to admire leaders and existing institutions, not to challenge them, more likely to have a negative attitudes towards underprivileged groups, to a lesser but significant degree. Those who adhere to the just world tend to feel less of a need to engage in activities to change society. So ideology is a driver, right? Ideology is really, really powerful. And there's a sort of this just world idea that helps to maintain how things are kept into place. So part of our ideology, you mentioned before, like, this sort of American dream idea, rags to riches story, that sort of idea that we kind of cite and we kind of identify, is really powerful. It's a powerful ideology. We believe in this sort of idea about mobility. It's a key part of the American dream. It's not that there's no mobility in the United States, right? There's opportunity in the United States. But I think we are trained, we are socialized to think about unbridled opportunity, unrestrained opportunity. We all have equal chance, right? And we have a hard time getting into the spaces where we start to be able to address the inequalities themselves. And by not addressing the inequalities, we are serving the interest of the establishment, the interest of power, the interest of the elite when we fail to engage in that discussion. This is kind of like some different Pew Research study kind of stuff, looking at more affluent people are more likely to attribute wealth to personal effort, right? So why is a person rich? And people with less money see, well, they've had more privilege. The wealthier person is, they see it's their own individual effort. And maybe that's like in part a human kind of trait and characteristic to think that it's through their own work. But I'd argue that's part culture too, right? Is culture trains us to think that I am self-made or a person is self-made. So if I'm rich, I did that on my own. But the reality is nobody does anything on their own. I always think about Jeff Bezos. Here's just a great example. I mean, would Jeff Bezos' trajectory been different if he was of a different race, if he was female, if he was born in a family of poverty, right? So all these different kind of things just sort of raise the question, well, I mean, it's not to take away from Jeff Bezos and what he's accomplished. It's never to take away what somebody has done. He's exhibited a lot of, initiative, hard work and drive and all different kind of things. But, it's more than just him. There's a lot of other things that are going on. And he went to Princeton University, access to institutions to get him in a position to be able to get into Princeton University and develop social connections through that. So there's a lot more, right? But we tend to think that it's personal effort. Republicans are more likely than Democrats to say that people are rich because they worked harder as well. So there are political differences, right? More conservative, more liberal. More liberal sees structure as being a key player. More conservative tends to see it's the individual. It's kind of one way of sort of looking at it. Republicans attribute wealth to working harder rather than having greater advantages in life. And we look over within a short window, we got four years, 2014 to 2018. But basically things are moving and changing, right? So how we think about things moves and changes across time, across our own political affiliation. The question is why, or how do we think, and sort of what's that impact of thinking on the social world? This is 2014, so it's almost, 8 years old, 7 years old in terms of this research, but it's really, and I hope they redo it at some point. I mean, I don't think the data's changed all that much, but it's a really great research study and also interesting information. It really establishes the point. So we are outliers compared to a lot of other countries. So outlier in the sense that we believe in rugged individualism. So the percent who disagree that success is determined by forces outside of your control. So basically, the United States, we don't believe that things outside of our control determine or heavily influence our outcome. We are the outlier. I mean, here's Germany. It's not about capitalism versus non-capitalism or these kind of things, but Germany, it's about culture that's shaping these particular beliefs and ideas. We believe that the individual is the one who determines their fate in life. Person who say is very important to work hard to get ahead in life. Look, we are way out here, and here's the average is 50% among economically developed countries. So we have this sort of rugged individualistic perspective. This short little video here is Robert Reich, a economist, Department of Labor during the Clinton administration, talking about this idea, the mythology of rugged individualism. Horatio Alger stories, Rags to Riches. These are the American narrative and story going back. These were dime store novels in the early 1900s. Rags to Riches. It's sort of the strong ideology that we have. A lot of sports films. Going back, I think about Rocky or the film, even like Blindside. I mean, usually a lot of sports films are these rags to riches stories. Hoosiers, right? These kids from a rural Indiana. But it's through their work and their dedication that they become the stars, right? That's that narrative and that story is a deeply American story. This is a editorial cartoon by Theodore Bissell, who is Dr. Seuss, right? We're just going to knock out the unnecessary floors designed by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, reactionary wrecking crew. So during FDR's time period, after the Depression, Roosevelt established a lot of social structure stuff, Social Security, unemployment, benefits to different groups. So providing this sort of social structure, the government taking on more of a role in providing a social structure. And there's sort of this idea of wrecking that down. And part of that, I think, is this sort of illustration is that it should be left up to the individual. The problem with that is that if you're already stratified and you're leaving it up to the individual, well, we're just going to reinforce a system of inequality because it's the resources are not distributed in ways that are helping to equalize things or to be able to give people the freedom to be able to explore or to move themselves, to be mobile. You can read this. I kind of talked about a little bit about the sort of idea of Bezos and whether or not he's an individualist, or whether or not he was self-made. Even thinking about things, about what goes on in terms of the warehouse or technologies that he's benefited from. I mean, these aren't self-made, right? He took advantage of them. He is an entrepreneur. He's a hard worker. It's not to take away any of that, but it's a more complicated story than just him. The third theme of stratification is looking at basically different theories, right? So the nutshell of it is that, or in a nutshell, you have the Davis-Moore thesis, which was popular. God, when was Davis and Moore? Probably 50s and 60s, be my guess, when they were doing their work. It was a time period of fairly conservative thought in sociology. And it was a time period, you think about conservative thought in America and culture in that time period as well. They forward this idea, it's called the Davis-Moore thesis, that basically, since stratification is universal, it must serve a function. It's kind of like that biological organism idea, right? So if it's within a system, it serves a function. So it serves a function, and part of the function that stratification serves is to reinforce certain values and ideals. Part of how society is structured is a reflection of the functional importance of the job itself. So the more functionally important the job is to individuals, to groups, to society, the higher the wages. So if you look at these different positions here within medical industry, we say, okay, well, that's a reflection of the functional value of the work that individuals are doing. The limitation of this theory is that it doesn't address things that are shaping the pay that are not about functional importance, but about groups who can establish labor conditions and compensation, degree of compensation, how compensation happens within an organization. And that's not about functional importance, it's about power. So you can look at, I mean, this is over a course of time. Like right now in 2020, the average CEO versus the average worker is 270 to 1. So the average CEO in the United States makes 270 to 1 compared to the average worker. In the 1970s, I think it was around 70 to 1. So functionalism can't address that issue. I mean, to argue that the CEO is 270 times greater of functional importance is a weak argument, a faulty argument to be able to make that. So there's some value in Davis-Moore thesis to say, okay, there's those positions that are more functionally important are compensated differently. No question. It's the degree to which they're compensated becomes the issue, and functionalism can't address that particular piece. Conflict theory goes after sort of that relationship to means of production, right? So think about who's establishing the ways of compensation. Are you the owner? Are you the worker? As a worker, do you have the ability to organize, the ability to have a voice within that system? If we look at things like, I mean, unions and labor unions are there to be a voice for workers. The United States has a long history of anti-unionization in the United States. We are at about 11% in terms of workers who are in labor unions today. Of those workers, a majority of them are public employees, law enforcement, school teachers, et cetera. So, so the private sector, it's very harsh environment for establishing labor unions within business and enterprise in the United States. And that has an impact in terms of compensation. If we look at, and compensation could be things like paid vacation days. There are 0 federally required vacation days for workers in the United States. And then you kind of look at it across countries, right? You could look at maternity leave. I should put Norway in there in terms of maternity leave or family leave. So that 1 year is common. I mean, to have 1 full year, and I mentioned before that could be extended, but may have less pay if you extend it beyond that. And which also her argument in this too is that it's good for business. She interviews a lot of different business leaders and they can make adjustments. It's not create a crisis within an organization to have that. Businesses don't actually have to pay for that maternity leave. It's part of the tax base. So there's sometimes it gives them a flexible workforce. So there's some advantage there as well. Universal healthcare. It's like, all those countries, yes, the United States, no. The Gini Coefficient, that degree of inequality. And then last is sort of the tokenism. Token, like somebody makes it, a person makes it, Oprah Winfrey makes it, somebody makes it out, Jeff Bezos, it becomes our story. He's not a token though, I guess he's white male. But usually a token is somebody who makes it out so climbs from rags to riches and makes it. And then they become sort of this token. Well, they made it, therefore everybody else can too, right? And that reinforces that ideology. Bourdieu gets into this thing of thinking about stratification is that it's reproduced at a social cultural level. And so it's social reproduction of class. So the ways that we talk, our demeanor, our disposition, our attitude, our orientation to resolving conflict, conversation, our taste that we develop, taste for food, our experiences in terms of travel or places that we visit, all that kind of stuff is we're reproducing our position within the social world. So it's social reproduction. He identifies things like social capital, our networks, our connections, and how our development of our networks and connections can be have an influence on our opportunities, opportunities for employment, opportunities for other things, right? So it's social connections. Central Oregon is such, and I think it was more this way as we moved here in 2004. So I think it's even more so in the past that it's who you knew was really powerful. That's social capital, right? So it's our networks, part of our social, we're reproducing stratification based on our social capital and our cultural capital, what we know. And I'll leave you can watch these 2 videos to give you a little bit more background information. Give you one example, which I think is a really powerful one. Annette LaRue did ethnographic research, spent a lot of time in families, middle-class families, working-class families, and talked about this idea of how social reproduction basically is happening in a professional middle class, upper middle class family. She talked about that the parents focused on concerted cultivation, getting kids into the right schools, get them into the programs in the arts and sports to basically position them to be able to for college and sort of for professional occupations. Also cultivating certain skills, certain abilities to navigate institutions. So when there's an issue going on within school, and there may be, I don't know, a kid's not doing very well in school, that concerted cultivation, working with the teachers, the parents are working with the teachers. We talk about like this sort of idea of a helicopter parent, much more common in sort of the professional middle class. And then for the working class, talk about natural growth. Parents were caring and devoted, but they allowed their kids to have more opportunity for natural growth, to be less involved in orchestrating their life in that regard. And her perspective, I've always thought was a really powerful one, was that there's neither choice of parenting is better than the other. Both of them are reflections of their own class position that they are in. That's kind of like the reflection of their own social world. And then, but what the difference is that it argues or provides is that while neither one is better than the other, there's institutional advantage by being parented, but with concerted cultivation. That kids learn in that kind of environment how to be self-empowered, how to advocate for themselves, how to navigate systems, and they're learning things about navigating the social world and navigating institutions like higher education in ways that kids from a natural growth experience do not. I mean, we have special resources, for example, at colleges and universities for first generational students. It's a whole different culture going to school. I mean, going to university, going to college, going to community college if you're first generation, I mean, there's a lot going on. That's a culture that's not intuitive. That's difficult to navigate. And if you haven't had that cultural capital and social capital to navigate those kind of things, it can make the likelihood of success in those institutions more difficult. So yeah, Bourdieu gets in all these kind of fun things, or interesting things about how we become kind of our culture. You could think about it as a middle class culture, working class culture, all these different cultural kind of things that we are reproducing social position within that. And then the next theme is this myth of meritocracy. So we kind of talk about this a little bit. It's also a little bit about ideology. Meritocracy, so merit is your skills, talents, and abilities. So the ocracy part is thinking about stratification or thinking about organization. So we believe that this sort of idea that the way that society is organized and stratified is based on merit. Those who have more merit, more skills, more talent, more devotion are higher up in the system itself. Michael Sandel, and there's some great podcasts with him talking about this idea of the tyranny of merit. And it's really profound. I mean, I listened to his podcast talking about this idea of the why it's not true and why it's harmful. The term merit and meritocracy actually emerged in the 1950s by someone in the UK from the Labour Party, and it was meant to be a criticism of the existing system that people in the UK at that particular time were basically justifying inequality, disregarding the structural aspects of what's generating the system. And so the Michael Young provide this idea of meritocracy to critique that stuff, that people were like, oh, you just work hard and kind of stuff like that. But eventually, in the United States, we've taken that on to say, well, that's who we are. We're meritocratic. Those who have the most skills are the ones that are most rewarded. And Sandel talks about things like the immigrant story. We tell that story that people are self-made versus thinking about gratitude and being thankful for opportunities. We view the individual versus the individual, him or herself, or themselves, sort of having gratitude for the help and support that they received. I like the immigrant story that he provides is that no one is let's say that, in my family, go back two generations ago, they left their country, parents left their country because of political, social, or other reasons, turmoil or other reasons. And now I am here, two generations later. Well, it's because they immigrated that I had the opportunity to be in this place, right? And so it's with gratitude, meritocracy, this idea that it's only the self, prevents individuals from, and collectively as a society, to recognize that it's more than just the individual talent and ability. And we need to, he's arguing and advocating that we need to have more gratitude for our connection to the past and the supports and the systems that we're involved in, and to recognize that, to be more honest and transparent about that. Sometimes our politicians, this is more contemporary Obama, other politicians as well, focus on, well, get an education, right? Like, this is the pathway to the great equalizer. And yeah, I mean, education can be, right? But when we do that, we do a disservice to say that education is the way forward. It's one way forward, but when we do that, we're ignoring the inequalities that exist in society itself. I mean, living wage jobs, for example. And it reinforces this meritocratic idea that if you just get an education, it's what's holding you back is your lack of education itself. And so it reinforces this idea, this sort of meritocracy kind of thing. There's also the issue of luck that Sandel brings up. There's luck, right? Luck about, where you end up, opportunities, things that come at your doorstep. And if it's only merit, we're less humble, right? We're get really grandiose about thinking about others yourself. And it's unfounded. Things like, and I thought it was interesting too, his example of thinking about, a basketball player is one example he uses, their abilities, but imagine, the abilities they develop, but imagine you have that height and you live in a different country and there is no basketball, but they're swimmers or something like that. It just happens to be luck that the skills and talents that you have are also financially rewarded in your society at that point in time. So basically, the belief in the idea reinforces this system of inequality. This chart here is where today's 25-year-olds went to college, grouped by parents' income. And you kind of look at where do people go to school, right? Based on income. And you can see, I think that, man, okay, I include this here to demonstrate or to highlight that there's more going on than merit, right? So people end up in these institutions in part because in these institutions I'm thinking of, or these, based on their family position, the resources that are available to them. These individuals, there's part merit in that. It's not that there's no merit, but to think about that they are in these institutions because of their merit and merit alone fails to take into consideration the schools and opportunities that these individuals had, the cultural environment that they were in. I mean, you kind of go on and on and on and on and on about that, right? But that's kind of the idea. So another myth, the myth of meritocracy is, think about, I don't know why I have myth 4, but sort of thinking about the myth of meritocracy is thinking about, well, who has more merit? If you grew up in the top 5%, private school, have a lot of cultural capital, social capital, financial support, lived in a cultural soup of white collar professionalism, and then became a physician working in a private clinic. Well, let's say you grew up in the bottom 5%, public schools, low graduation rate, didn't have a lot of access to advanced coursework, a lot of structural stress in community, low social capital, cultural capital, and became a physician, treating people at a public clinic, serving those with high needs and also working at a private clinic. Well, if this person makes more than this person, I would argue there's more merit. I mean, if you look at sort of merit, there's more going on in merit, trying to illustrate here. So that's kind of the focus. Okay, another sort of theme here is sort of thinking about the limitations of an individual or cultural level analysis of things. So there's the culture of poverty, which became popular in the I think it was 70s when Oscar Lewis did his work, anthropological work of looking at 5 different families and looking at basically he developed this idea of it's a culture of poverty. People stay in poverty, they develop a culture of poverty. Individuals become within a community, within a family, develop certain ways of thinking and doing that keeps them trapped, where they don't save for the future, for example, less engaged in social institutions, less involved in education. There's been a lot of critique of this culture of poverty thesis. I think it drew a lot of attention in the United States and was supported in the United States because it fit our dominant ideology, right? It's not the fault, or it's not the system, it's not the individual in this case, it's the culture of a particular group that's driving and maintaining their social position. I mean, think about things like saving for the future. Well, if you're poor, you can't save for the future, right? So which one's chicken versus the egg? I mean, if you're wealthy, you can save for the future. If you don't have wealth, you're using your money to survive in day-to-day life. And Oscar Lewis would identify things like, well, they're not saving for the future. That's what's keeping them basically stuck in their position. And he argues that's a cultural thing. It's like, well, there's other things that are going on there that are being minimized and not being looked at. And then we could look at it, we get a very individual sort of level of analysis, thinking about to the genetic level, right? That the cause of basically inequality is genetic. And we don't go there today, but I just sort of bring this up, that sort of this sort of level of thinking about eugenics. We talked about maybe before about this idea of good genes, EU meaning good, and genetics. This was sort of popular in the United States. We think about Nazi Germany, but this was founded in the United States. This idea about race and class get brought into that. This idea that poverty is being generated by basically bad genes. And so we did things like involuntary sterilization, trying to ensure that people who were of good stock were marrying people, good stock, breeding for a better society. I mean, that's scary stuff, right? But that captured that ideology helped to maintain a system of inequality, because it wasn't the fault of, or it wasn't shaped by structure. It was all, in this case, very genetic. And that while the idea of eugenics is way gone in the past, it's still around in strange ways. 1980s, Herrnstein and Murray came up with this book, The Bell Curve, and a lot of criticism of the book because they were arguing that the race and class dimensions, there's a genetic reason for stratification. So that ideology still resonates to some extent in our culture. There's some myths of poverty and welfare that I think are important to talk about as well. So the federal poverty line for family of four is $26,000. If you're made federal minimum wage, you'd make $14,500 over the course of a year. So if you had two people working minimum wage and they're in a family of four, so two parents, two kids, let's say, they're making over the federal poverty line. But can you imagine trying to survive in society and trying to make it at that level of income that's pre-taxes? 23% of families living in poverty received welfare benefits. Those benefits, temporary assistance to needy families, is what TANF stands for. There's a lot of restrictions. I mean, there's over a course of one's lifetime, they can get 60 months of support. That's 5 years over a course of one's lifetime. The cash assistance for a family of three in the state of Oregon is a little bit over $500 a month. The idea that there's welfare dependency is actually faulty. It's actually a mythology about that, the degree to which welfare dependency actually happens. And this is the welfare system, the way we think about welfare. Democrats going back to Clinton in the 1990s really did a number on, or really targeted and took out support or removed support for lower income families. So this isn't a project that, it's been Republicans and Democrats who have basically created policies that have made it difficult for that segment of society. And then this other concept of structural social mobility, a really important one. So we think about social mobility at the individual, but we also can think about it as the structure of society itself has shifted. So what happened in the 1970s, the post-industrial society emerges. We go our manufacturing base. So we have a manufacturing-based society, 1800s, 1900s, agricultural manufacturing, but manufacturing becomes more and more prominent, powerful in the 1900s. Starting in the 1970s, we become deindustrialized. So there's a structural shift going on. So we lose manufacturing jobs, decline. There becomes advancements in technologies that are being used in manufacturing to decrease the number of workers required. So productivity increases, efficiencies increase, and worker reliance on workers decreases. Our jobs that get paid more get moved to different professional jobs. So think about computer programmers, science, technology, different kind of things like that. More automation, globalization. So the impact of globalization on workers, the impact of globalization on kind of policies. Also a time period of a lot of anti-unionization in the United States. And then we haven't kept up with minimum wage. So structural shift, 1970s. William Julius Wilson in this book, When Work Disappears, he looks at places like Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit. And basically, you can read the title of the book, right? When work disappears, what happens to the community? And it's a real profound book. It's a really great book to sort of get at. When jobs disappear, when work disappear, usually those who have the most resources move to places where there are occupations are growing. So then what's the impact of them leaving to the community itself? What happens to social infrastructure? What happens to civic organizations? What happens to the glue that holds a community together? Work disappears, people have the most ability to move, at least, a significant part of them move, or a portion of them move. And those individuals probably provide a lot of leadership for civic organizations in a community. So the community suffers, creates an environment where crime and other social problems are more likely to happen. So it's a structural issue. And this is a more recent book, Nicholas Kristof and Wudun, who wrote this book about Oregon City. And it's a real powerful, really depressing book though too, about Oregon City, who had a manufacturer, I think they manufactured rubber gloves maybe, all the way until the 1970s, 1980s. And then the mills closed down at that same time as well. Kristof grew up in that community. When he grew up, it was families were relatively stable. The community was stable. It wasn't that there was no problems in that community, but it was a fairly stable community. Jobs disappeared. And now he goes back and he interviews and talks with people he went to high school with in the community. A lot of significant health problems, drug problems, other problems going on. And that's a great example of this idea of structural social mobility. It moves us away from that individual, these are bad people, to look at what's happened in that community over a longer period of time. I don't know, just a couple different charts here, just kind of getting this sort of idea about structural social mobility, the impact on different groups, are basically, with that move away from manufacturing, we started to, United States looked at different places for manufacturing where there was less regulation, where profits could be higher, right? So capital has no commitment to community. Capital has commitment to increasing value in terms of profitability. And the consequences, there can be consequences to community if not regulated well. So maquiladoras for factories at the US-Mexico border. Just really interesting stuff about that, right? So we'd manufacture something in Mexico, we then bring it right back here to the United States for distribution. And I mean, it's like, what's going on, right? What's going on with that? Who benefits from those particular policies and what's the impact on community? And then the eighth one here is like thinking about the cost of making it and making adjustments. And this is what's really kind of interesting. I think this chart here, well, actually start here. People of, 25 or older who completed high school or college, looking at from 1940 to today. And we look at sort of the growth that a bachelor's degree, more and more people getting into bachelor's degree, high school degree required, right? So more education required. And we can see the advantage, right? So the advantage has grown, or the distance has grown. Back in the 1960s, you think about Central Oregon in this regard, it was possible, and it's still possible today, but it was more possible in the past. Graduate, you have a high school degree, and you can basically support a family, and you can make it, and you can make it. The reality today, that's increasingly less likely. It's not that it's impossible, but much less likely. So we have a gap that's grown. And then it raises the question about, well, how about access to resources to get that college education? This is an interesting comparison looking at 87 to 2016, the cost of a college education, of undergraduate degree. Graduated without debt back then, now having a lot of debt for 13 years, right? So people going to school, but now have to accumulate debt in order to make that happen. Looking at Oregon State University, looking at the increase over a course of time, looking at, if you worked a part-time job, how much could you pay for in terms of that education itself? I mean, it's getting more and more expensive to be able to make it sort of into those positions, this new economy. So it's a reflection and generates inequality itself. And there's different things that we can do, right? And each of these are controversial. Each of these push up against our ideology in society, right? I think there's an issue of power being protected in this. There's a lot of stuff going on that's shaping our policies. And then when we're having a discussion about what to do about changing things, it gets challenging, right? For a lot of different reasons. But at least what I would argue or perspective provide is that these remedies or proposals for change, it's not that they're right or wrong. They can have these influences. What I'm interested in looking at sometimes is who's reacting, who's opposing, and what's their argument for opposing. So raising the minimum wage gets fascinating to me sometimes as individuals who don't have a lot of background in looking at these issues of minimum wage, may vehemently be opposed to raising the minimum wage because I believe that they've accepted this dominant cultural ideology about certain conditions and certain ways of thinking and knowing. And they are carrying that ideology forward and reacting to ideas of things like the government increasing minimum wage and sort of they go into this sort of space of economic impact on businesses and community, and it's going to be bad for business and these kind of things. I want to know, well, how did you get to that conclusion? And to me, it's like this thing of ideology, I think is going to be in there in some way. It's hard. If you look at sort of wages across different nations and different countries, we look at wages in the United States, we look at the establishment of the federal minimum wage, we look at sort of the minimum wage and how it hasn't kept up. We look at places like Seattle, where Seattle as a city increased its minimum wage. We look at states that have increased their minimum wage. I mean, we look at different issues. I think the argument is that increasing it is the reaction to it may be more about ideology than it is about the practical aspects of increasing the minimum wage. There's things that we can do too, invest in early childhood education. I'm not arguing that we should be Norway, Sweden, Denmark. I mean, we are different, our culture is different, but there are lessons to be learned. I mean, one thing about, that in Norway is universal childcare. And that's a social evener, for lack of better words. I mean, it evens the playing field, right? Think about the cost of early childhood education. It levels the playing field. I guess that's what I was looking for. Having the ability having policies that allow for or support lower and middle income families for developing wealth, building assets, making tax codes more progressive, having the top 1%, the top 5% pay more in terms of their taxes. This is kind of a chart I kind of put together to kind of look at maybe some of the stuff all into kind of action in a way. We have our cultural beliefs, our ideology about rugged individualism and meritocracy. We have status, the positions that we have in society. We have this idea of tokens, a person who makes it, they become a token for everything else. Looking at mobility, intergenerational mobility, we have this sort of idea of social reproduction, that we're reproducing in our basically social cultural capital and these kind of things. So what is the objective relationship between the individual and social forces becomes kind of the question. Cultural and group influences on our understanding. I mean, our group that we belong to, culture shapes how we think about stratification. What equals an influence on social position on the views of individualism? I mean, what shapes our views of that? Where did we come about thinking about individualism in particular ways? What are the meanings that we attribute to ourselves and to others in different groups? I mean, these are all things that we've learned along the way in some sort of way. View of how to bring about change, is something that is learned. Evaluation, how do we think about fairness, right? So these different rungs and climbing the ladder, how we think about that climbing the ladder, there's a lot going on in terms of shaping and thinking about that. And then finally, just a little bit of, different applications, different kind of things, just a few last couple parts. Interesting book called Billionaire Wilderness, a sociologist from Yale who interviews 200 some people from Teton County, Wyoming. This came out this past year, of the ultra wealthy in Teton County, and is really interesting read. So it's ethnographic work. He basically spends time interviewing, chatting with people who are really wealthy, which I thought when I read the review of this book first, I was like, wow, man, to get access to interviewing the real wealthy, that was impressive in and of itself. And I think his credentials, being from Yale, being white, definitely helped facilitate that. Teton County, the county with the greatest degree of inequality of any county in the United States, the highest per capita income in the United States in Teton County. And he basically, the reason he studies the wealthy is because he says, we focused a lot on studying the poor. We need to also study the wealthy to understand things. So that's part of Teton County, the West, sort of idea of rugged individualism takes place in the West, the landscape of the West. And it's really interesting. He comes up with this idea about class confusion, that a lot of the people he interviews, they go there, they're coming to Teton County to escape their other world in a way, but they're bringing their world with them. And they want to be normal. So they say, oh, we're, somebody who's really wealthy, they have a helicopter pad in their backyard, but we're like everybody else in the community, all the local residents. Some of my best friends are ski, they operate the ski lift. But they're not their best friends, right? There's this class confusion that develops. I'm very close to all sorts of people in town. Farrell asks, the author asks, specific examples. I know one guy really well, and he goes on about this employee at a local fish market who gives him this track about halibut. It's just a real tight-knit community. And they really have this sort of sense they want to belong and connect to this community, but they're so outside of the average person within that community. They're in this sort of real bubble of a world. And it's really fascinating to sort of discussion and focus on the sort of class confusion, different aspects of class that come up in his work. An interesting thing, sort of thing about philanthropy he looks at. That one's not the philanthropy. But where do people give money? There's a lot of philanthropy going on within the community, and people giving money, the billionaires giving money to community. But where they're giving money is to protecting the environment, which isn't necessarily bad, but but it's in their own self-interest. So what they're doing is they're giving money to land trusts. So the money is going into these land trust issues. Rockefeller, old wealth, created public domain for the Teton Mountains and the wilderness, gave that land to the public. The new rich are creating these, with these protections, giving land to the public, so to speak, but it's private land. They're putting it in sort of these preservation model. So they're giving it, but it's in their own self-interest. They're not giving it to the public, but they're putting in this sort of protection and preservation kind of thing. And they don't like to talk about buzzkill issues like affordable housing, for example, which I thought was really interesting. So the really wealthy in that community, they want to talk about, protecting protecting the wolf, or they want to talk about protecting land. Even they've worked in these industries that have been, extraction energy industries where they develop that's where they've made their money. And yet they become this sort of environmentalists in a really weird way. They're trying to protect the wilderness, but yet they worked in industries that may have less respect for the public space in that regard. And they don't want to talk about buzzkill issues. They don't want to talk about things that are the realities of the working people in those communities. And it is really kind of powerful kind of examination of kind of the wealthy class. I don't know, last couple things here. This is just an interesting thing about structured inequality. I was in Cleveland years ago, traveling around the United States, and I was in a parking garage, and I was getting ready to leave the parking garage, and there's a car in front of me, couldn't get out. And I was like, okay, what's going on? How can I help this person to get out? Another person came forward and said, hey, or he asked the question, I think it was like, how do I get out of here? I have money, but I don't have a card. So the only way to get out of that parking garage is with a debit card. And this person only had cash. We had to back our cars up. He had to move his car, and then he had to walk like a block to this place to get a ticket in order to get out. And I was just like, wow, that is really powerful, right? This sort of thing at a dated, just sort of a take it for granted world, right? That, for those who have access to and have a debit card, it's no big deal. You don't have a bank, you don't have a banking account, you don't have a card. Society is structured in a way that makes your experience in that structure fundamentally different. And then finally is this video. I wish they wouldn't have the background music, the sort of doomsday background music kind of thing. But it's a really great capture of looking at distribution of wealth in the United States over a course of time. So I encourage you to watch that. All right, that's it. That's a lot of stuff. Hopefully that kind of provided perspective about stratification and a lot of material covered. Yeah, be safe, be well. Have yourself a great day. We'll chat with you sometime down the road.